Hi, and welcome to our first panel. As Jose was just saying, this panel will be on predictable AI futures. So how can we make sure that we understand or are able to have a good idea about what sort of AI systems are to come? I'm joined right now with Seán O'Heigeartaigh, who gave a great talk on predictable AI futures just half an hour ago from the University of Cambridge. Also with me is Lawrence Phillips, the AI forecasting lead from Metaculus, who we've heard a lot about. Also, I have Serhiy Kandul, who is a postdoc at the Digital Society Initiative at the University of Zurich, and also Irina Rish from the University of Montreal up on the screen. So before I sort of open up the questions to everyone more broadly, I just wanted to ask a general question to everyone. One of the things that Seán said in his talk was that our track record with prediction is relatively good, but I'm wondering if there are any patterns or types of predictive questions that we're sort of consistently failing on and consistently mispredicting, and I'm wondering how we can sort of adjust our forecasting methods in order to deal with this and what we can learn from these mistakes.
So we have actually looked into this question a little bit at Metaculus, trying to predict the accuracy or quality of our forecasts on the basis of... Oh, yeah, sorry about that. So we have done some work on this, attempting to predict the accuracy of our forecasts on the basis of certain features of the question. And actually, we found it was very hard to identify any concrete patterns. This may be due to just small data set issues, but really it's actually pretty hard to say anything beyond the longer the time horizon is, the more accurate the less accurate you're likely to be. The less forecasters you have involved in a question, the less accurate you're likely to be. But beyond that, in terms of specific topics or specific attributes of a question, hard to say anything based on the data that we have.
Great, thanks for that, Lawrence. Does anyone else have anything that they want to add on that specific question? Any insight?
I guess I'd sort of second that. The longer the time horizon, the less accurate. I think, I don't know, it's interesting to speculate on kind of what the sort of psychological reasons for that are. I mean, one is that there's, I guess, less information about the world that we can infer from, but I think there's also less to keep us kind of grounded and honest in a sense, and easier to fall prey to excessive optimism or pessimism. And I think this isn't unique in any sense to AI. I've been very interested to see the kind of predictions that have been happening, and for example, transitions to renewables, relating to the climate crisis. As soon as we're talking about milestones to be met by 2050, things are being proposed that are clearly unachievable. But if kind of milestones are set for nearer points in time, suddenly it becomes real, and suddenly you need to think about, well, if X amount of energy needs to be achieved from renewables by 2040, that means that X over 2 needs to be achieved by 2035, and that starts breaking down into individual pieces that we can sort of track the path from here to there on, and start saying, well, actually, is this realistic? Okay, this bit isn't unless you expect some sort of energy miracle or funding miracle. And so I think there's an aspect to that. As soon as you bring it to a point in time where you can decompose it a bit and start actually saying things that you feel like, yes, actually, I would like bet some of my savings on this happening or not happening, then the accuracy jumps way up. But there is a problem that when it's a bit further out, there isn't anything to kind of ground us and keep us honest in that way, and so it's much easier to fall prey to our biases, whether that's optimism or pessimism.
Thank you, Seán and Lawrence. I guess, so one thing that Irina was talking about earlier with these broken scaling laws, right? And we've seen sort of consistent scaling, similar patterns in terms of just the overall trend of the field as a whole, right? Like we've seen sort of exponentially growing flop usage and so on. I'm wondering if we could sort of try and make use of the broken neural scaling laws that Irina was talking about and sort of apply them to not just individual systems, but sort of populations of where the field is at, and maybe then try and identify possible sort of phase transitions, like the jump to, say, language models that seem to sort of come out of nowhere for a lot of us in the field. Do you have anything you'd like to say about that?
Yeah, I think it definitely could be interesting experiment to try. Like we were discussing that it's good to have as many points as possible, so you actually can have a better estimate of parameters. And in case of like having statistics on like multiple systems and so on, it definitely seems to be a good kind of case. I don't know like how much data you will need, but at least, well, it's definitely worth trying, I would say.
I thought it was quite interesting when I was looking at some of the Epoch AI papers that I mentioned during my talk. They did something a bit like this, but for kind of machine learning to date. And actually they were able to identify what seemed like 3 distinct kind of eras of machine learning, where the kind of characteristics in terms of increasing flop use and so on kind of stayed relatively kind of constant, and then there was kind of a phase shift to a second phase, and then a phase shift to a third phase. So that actually sounds like exactly the kind of thing you're talking about. I guess the question then becomes, can we predict phase shifts going forwards, which I haven't gone into the broken scaling laws paper yet, but I'm really looking forward to disappearing at some point tomorrow and reading through it.
Yeah, indeed, you can think about that you have several segments with different behavior, and between those shifts, behavior looks kind of linear, indeed. Yeah, so as I said, I mean, it all depends on the details of the data and whether there are enough points and so on, but it actually would be really interesting to try. And actually, it's a good idea. I remember that plot from Epoch AI. Yeah, I almost even used it in my presentation. Like it's Epoch AI reports are amazing source of material also for the class. We have this seminar style scaling and alignment class right now, and they did amazing job, like just collecting literature and characterizing things. So, okay, it's a good idea. We could try to see if the type of plots they showed can be indeed fit into broken neural scaling laws, and we can see to what extent they can extrapolate. Yeah, I don't know if it's gonna work or not, but we can try.
Thank you. I'm now going to open up the questions to the audience. So just pop your hand up if you have a question, if you want to ask any of our esteemed panelists, and someone will come over with a microphone. So yeah, any questions? I'm struggling to see because of the light, so please make it clear. One there.
Thanks. So we have a lot of theory about predicting performance and losses and everything, but how do we connect those predicted losses to predicted impacts on society? Like this little step from measurement of performance or predicted measurement of performance to, okay, how will this affect my daily life? Yeah. To anybody.
So this is a really important question because I mean, that's where it actually starts to matter. And I think it's something that we haven't done very well because particularly those people who are building things sometimes have deep insights into like how they will be used. But actually a lot of the time you don't know how it's going to be used until you like throw it open to a wide population of people who then like find all sorts of interesting and innovative and sometimes unwanted ways of using the thing that you've developed. And it seems to me that what we need to do is a bunch of what is sometimes referred to as things like participatory futures. We need to, like, okay, people who are developing can kind of look at it as like, okay, we're going to be developing the ability to like turn words on a page into a generated piece of kind of animation or video or something. That's cool. You're not necessarily going to think of all the different ways you could do that. But what you could do, for example, is get together a cross-section of people who work in animation, in marketing, in art of different sorts, and just throw them at it. What I'd love to see a lot of is sort of, you might call them installations. Get some people together who are able to showcase some technologies and also like talk about what's going to be possible in 2 or 3 years. So, okay, maybe now you can only make a 30-second bit of video, but actually you're going to be able to make a 3-minute bit of video. This is the depth of expertise you're going to need to be able to use the software. And here's like how the accuracy is going to improve. And then like get a bunch of people in and like see what they come up with. And I think if you had like this happening on a regular basis, like we'd be much less often surprised by it's released by OpenAI or whatever, and then suddenly we discovered that people are able to kind of imagine what Lord of the Rings would look like in a Mad Max universe, and similarly, like I'd love to, how could you use things like ChatGPT in an educational context? Okay, so we're discovering there's a problem that sometimes hallucinates things, and therefore you don't get full accuracy. But you could imagine people figuring out ways of like, can you have a an automated personal tutor that walks people through explanations of things at their level, and maybe like figures out like what level of kind of challenge or explanation is appropriate to the person based on their current understanding of the topic and so on, and suddenly move something that personal tutor is what rich kids had when I was growing up, and that gave them an advantage all the way through the educational system. I'd love a world in which we could be making those available to everyone and sort of leveling out. And similarly have people who join us to red team them. It's like, okay, you are just going to go out and basically like, what are all the kinds of mayhem you could do with this? Here's a capability that you've never seen before, and here's what we think is going to be possible in 3 years. Like, what kind of mayhem can you do? And then figure out, like, can we defend against that red team and blue team? I think there's a huge amount that could be done here. It's time consuming and it's costly. One of the important things here is you don't want to just take like the academic and government people who can afford to take time out of their day jobs to do this. You want to actually take working artists and working teachers and working taxi drivers and compensate them properly to spend some time really thinking through, like, what could I do with this? What kind of impact would this have on me? What does my trade union need to know about what's coming out here, and so forth? And then make sure their voices are in the policy process. I mean, this is my view on what's going to be needed, and it's going to be needed at scale all over the place, because otherwise we're going to end up constantly being kind of taken by surprise by that gap you mentioned.
Thanks, Seán. Does anyone else want to jump in and have anything else to say on the question?
Well, I can just quickly comment. I mean, there are probably some easier things. Like the question was like, how do we, well, say we can predict the performance, but how do we know how it's going to affect our daily life? Again, if we come up with some better metrics that may be related to kind of system effect on our daily life. So, for example, like truthfulness, right? Or other kind of metrics for alignment and so on. So if we, well, I know it's a hard open problem to come up with good metrics for alignment, but if you do, then that's something you can also treat as a metric on y-axis and try to predict using whatever scaling laws, and that may be easier. But of course, there are kind of second, third, and whatever nth order effects that those systems will produce in society, and that might be harder to measure kind of immediately. So yeah, and that is, yeah, that's always a problem. It's more of a, you may even need to, you might not have enough data, but you could use simulation of society and the effect of kind of different AI progress or whatever changes to see, basically you can try certain policies and see if you introduce this policy, whether the effect of the simulation will show you that it will kind of overall be kind of good or not. But it might be prohibitively kind of expensive. You can use large compute to do simulations of the future of society when trying different interventions and trying to speculate about different like trajectories of AI. But maybe simulating that will be just kind of too prohibitive. Although maybe it never hurts to try, like during COVID, people tried to simulate actually propagation of the disease. And based on those models, well, at least it was a bit more informed kind of decisions, at least sometimes. So I don't know. That's kind of basically using AI and simulations and large compute, not just to train better models, but to simulate their effect.
Thanks. Any more questions? Yeah. Oh, comments?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that this question actually seems like a fantastic use case for judgmental forecasting and forecasting platforms like Metaculus. Small plug there. You know, once we're out of the world of sort of clean quantitative scaling laws and into the world of very, very messy multifactorial considerations around how capabilities are going to impact society, it really feels as though the flexibility and breadth of human judgment is kind of what's needed. I'm not sure whether we have any better tools than human judgment to address these questions at this point. And I do agree that better metrics are crucial here, because if we're asking forecasting questions about how these things are going to impact society, they need to be precisely defined such that people can associate probabilities with the outcome. So if we have precise metrics that capture the impacts that we're interested in, this will facilitate forecasting. And we've touched on the importance of track records as well. And it feels as though we can really start asking these questions now and begin forecasting now to build a track record, see how good we are at it. Yeah.
Is that a comment from Irina's hand?
It's not a comment. Basically, I think Ethan Caballero is trying to join the call, but he's in the waiting room. So can you please let him in? And if anyone has questions about broken neural scaling, yeah, he will be online as well. But yeah, the system doesn't let him in yet. That's all.
We'll have someone. Okay,
Yeah.
we don't think we can. Okay.
Of course, we can do it in parallel. We don't have to wait. But thank you.
Okay. Question there, I think. Yeah.
Thank you. What do you think is the role of AI imaginaries and AI hype in predicting AI futures? Do the stories that we tell ourselves about the future become self-fulfilling prophecies?
Does anyone have a comment on that? Maybe Ethan, having just joined.
I didn't really hear the question because like it was halfway through when I joined.
Basically, will the stories that we tell each other about the future of AI become our self-fulfilling prophecies?
And also, it was a question about the role of AI imaginaries and AI hype in predicting AI futures.
So the first thing I'd say is this is a really good question. There's a big project being led at CFI by Dr. Kandul and Stephen Cave on AI imaginaries, AI in literature, AI in sci-fi movies, and how this shapes how we think about AI. And a number of other great researchers have done work on this during our time at Cambridge, including Dr. Sarah Dillon, who's in the English department. The role is definitely yes, but also no. So, for example, it is actually important that we think about how we present AI in all of these kind of imaginaries in literature and movies. For example, a recent paper that Kant and Stephen released looked at how AI researchers are presented in movies and books, and basically they're nearly always white men. And that tends to then just like, creates a stereotype, makes it kind of affects who wants to join a field, and that then kind of self-fulfills in terms of what the field looks like, and it just highlights how important it is to show diversity in the field and to present something that isn't just the kind of stereotypical kind of mad white man scientist developing an AI god. Imaginaries, I think, can be powerful in sort of making us think what's possible. I mean, if we look at other areas of science fiction, quite a few of the kind of subsequent inventions are things that have been sort of, imagined in the novels and the TV shows that we saw. I mean, there are any number of scientists, stories about scientists who kind of saw these kind of inventions in kind of on Star Trek or whatever, and then kind of wanted to go and see if something like that was possible. So I think these things can definitely shape what we aim for and what we try to achieve. So that's kind of the yes bit. The no bit, I think, is that when we write stories, and imaginaries aren't just stories, but let's say, and when we write stories, we try to write good stories, and good stories are ones in which interesting, shocking, unusual things happen. A lot of the ways in which AI will affect our world are not going to be kind of novel in that way. It's not going to necessarily be a self-driving car or a robot or something visual and that catches the imagination. It's going to be a lot of very kind of mundane but very, very powerful and transformative things, making our energy grids more efficient and, networkizing things and using our data in all sorts of ways. And there is a risk that some of the biggest transformations in terms of how our world works might sort of creep up on us because they are kind of less kind of imagination catching or less visual, and so kind of don't capture that place in our minds, but nonetheless result in a situation in which human expertise is very dependent on a whole load of AI systems that we don't really understand. There's a ton of stuff happening under the hood that we don't quite know how it's working and so on. So we do need to be mindful of what some people have called like the good story bias, that we don't over-focus on the things that make a good story and avoid the things, or ignore the things that aren't very interesting from the point of view of the story. And a lot of that's been, there's been a lot written about that in the area of climate futures, because it's easy to write a story about some catastrophic impact of climate change or some big kind of humanity comes together to do some sort of silver bullet solution, but actually a lot of climate change is just going to be a slow grind towards, soil erosion and droughts and flooding, and it's going to be boring and relentless and harmful, and we do actually need to be mindful of that reality and what's needed to face that, and a lot of the actions we're going to need to take are incremental sacrifices by individuals as well as major policy changes. I could speak about that too much, so I'll stop on that. But imaginaries have some drawbacks, but also play a really, really powerful role in how we think about things. And I actually do think that when we're talking about something like AI, where it can be used in so many different ways, there are many aspects in which the limit is what we can imagine. And so, the more we can actually sort of try to figure out how to use, for example, these generative models, the more we will come across some really novel and hopefully quite wonderful uses.
I think I see a hand.
Yeah, just wanted to comment. Oh, it was another hand?
Go ahead, Serhiy.
Okay, I'll try to be quick. I think that it is important what kind of stories we tell each other, because it determines where we're going to focus our research on. And that will determine the future. So basically, stories we do tell each other and ourselves do determine our future. So there is such thing as self-fulfilling prophecy, or at least kind of the mindset or the view of kind of how things, what the interaction between people and AI will be. It will determine actually the future of this interaction. And the example is, I mean, the classics. You can take the more kind of anxious stance. You can view us versus them. You can view AI as, well, AGI as some standalone agentic entity that is completely separate from humans and has potentially whatever evil behavior for whatever reasons, has nothing against humans, but, well, paper clips to maximize your stuff. And then you will invest your time and you will invest your research into kind of this type of scenarios and kind of notion of control over that standalone system. Or if you take completely different perspective, more like it's a society combining like human and non-human intellect, and in the society you have interactions. So if you take that kind of perspective of essentially it's like a mix of these different entities who collaborate and who constantly have dialogue, and you kind of use views from even like therapeutic dialogue. There are like all the classical books about how, well, in case of therapy, the doctor talks to the patient, but in general, there are all this like types of communication that's studied well. So from that perspective, if you develop system with like human in the loop always, then it's very different set of topics, research topics that you should be, well, maybe not completely different, but it's a different focus. And the question is like what research you want to focus on. It will depend on your view of that future, but then the research you focus on will determine that future. So it's really like when we say we predict AI future, it's not like it's happening to us because it's somewhat determined by us. So it's a interesting system where we predict something that we're making, right? So it's not completely just a passive prediction. I think the stories matter really much, and I think we need more maybe utopian than dystopian stories. And that will determine type of research we will be doing that I hope is more likely to lead towards that utopian rather than dystopian. But sorry, I was too long. Somebody wanted to comment as well.
Just a very brief comment to add on this. Indeed, there are these cross-cultural studies, and for example, comparing US and Japan. In Japan, you have this positive portraits of AI and robots, and so the goal there is not to see how this affects predictions, but how this affects technology adoption, and then say, okay, Japan was faster than US and stuff like that. But what in terms of predictions, I think what people would try to do, for example, there are surveys, you ask people, like, do you believe that ChatGPT would take your job? And many people would say, yes, I'm so afraid of this. It's like, so I think my impression is that when making this prediction, like to those who are not developing AI, right? So these are kind of people who would be affected by this. So what they try to extrapolate there, this risk aversion preference. So like, I'm happy not to be correct in my prediction, but I'm not willing to take this risk. So I push my, policymakers to take preventive action. So that's, we have heard today, there was this talk on EU AI Act, and you can see already that some of AI is in the forbidden zone. So it's not high risk. It's like, it's not possible to deploy. And if you think about this, like, oh, why? Why is that the case? What's going on? So I think that that's how I see this. So the public, having this risk averse, I think it's kind of general psychological phenomenon. So try to avoid risk. So pushing the policymakers to be a bit more preventive. So that's why they come up with these stories. Okay, ChatGPT will take my jobs, and like superhuman intelligence and stuff like that. But in fact, what's the data reveals is exactly as you said before. So basically, your job will be taken not by AI, but people who master ChatGPT. So you better, equip yourself with the tool.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite obvious. I mean, the old jobs will die, but there will be many more created because of that. So like a new profession of essentially the prompt engineer. I mean, seriously, I mean, it was not there a few years ago. And effectively right now, it's like a new thing. And yeah, I mean, same thing will be with other kind of generative models. So I think around the new models, there will be also new jobs. And I think maybe instead of watching passively that general public, which has some limited view and tends to kind of be more anxious, because when something is unknown, the natural reaction is to be anxious and afraid. So, and if that affects kind of the legislation and so on, so that's exactly the signal or indication to action that perhaps AI researchers should educate the public and lawmakers much more actively to affect those decisions. So it's like much more PR is required on AI researcher side to convince public and to convince governments. Because if we don't do it, somebody else will.
So I think this is a good point, but I'd like to push back a little bit in that, yes, it's definitely true that, you know, somebody will master ChatGPT and that's the person who will be doing the work. But if one person is doing the work that would have been done by 8 people before, then either the work needs to increase by 8x or there are fewer jobs in it. And so new jobs will be created, but we will see significant transitions. And during that transition period, there is a disruption which will be potentially very difficult for quite a number of people. And we do need to figure out how to support and empower those people. So, you know, if we look at history, you know, there was some point when 50% of people in the UK worked in agriculture. Now it's 2%. Those people went on to other jobs, but it takes time. And if you've spent all of your career, for example, I don't know, take a clean example, driving a lorry, and then like lorry driving becomes automated, it would be facile to say, oh, well, now you can be a prompt engineer. It's not so easy. You know, that's not the skill set that you've trained in for a while. No software company is going to look at your CV and say, oh, yeah, you're the person I'm going to hire as a prompt engineer. So we need to think about how we actually support people who've done a particular thing for a long time. You know, it'll be fine for their kids who can, you know, adapt to the next thing. But there are these transitions that need some more careful thinking. And there are also the people who, like, a lot of our AI, particularly generative AI, is fed on the work that people have done until this point. So if you're a graphic artist, you're at risk of getting a fraction of the amount of work you got previously because it's very easy just to like pump out a bunch of graphic art stuff. But like that thing is trained on a whole load of graphic art work that you and others did that ended up on the internet that, you know, for whatever reason was in the kind of Creative Commons or whatever. And you're not getting paid for that. And so we need to actually then start thinking about, well, if generative AI models are making a lot of money for some people and are automating sectors, but that's, you know, drawing on work that's happened previously by people, how do we make sure that those people are properly supported and compensated? Because, yeah, I mean, these models are basically drawing on the work that has already gone out there. So, and I think that all needs to be a two-way process. It's not just AI scientists kind of doing PR and educating the public. It's AI scientists with policymakers engaging in two-way conversations so that they understand, you know, how this is going to affect the communities that we're rolling these systems out into, what those people need, how we make it so that it sort of benefits them, that their previous work is appropriately compensated and that they're well supported into going into these next areas. And all of that has to be two-way. It can't be, you know, PR going in one direction. It has to be conversations.
Yeah, it's probably not even PR. Maybe even more useful would be kind of educational courses, so they can help people to kind of catch up faster with these potential new professions. And yes, you mentioned about like also like if the company makes sufficient amount of money based on the like prior contributions of those people, whether maybe indeed paying them some royalty or something like that. Yeah, but that all need to be thought through. Indeed. But also, I mean, it is in a sense, I mean, I just talked to some random people who are in graphic design, and I didn't really start the conversation about stable diffusion. They did. And they were saying like how exciting it is because now it's much more efficient, that you can just use it to generate, I don't know, 100 designs of bikes. I mean, some guy was like bike designer, and he said like 99 of those images don't make sense, but one will give me idea that I would never kind of think on my own. So you can use it as idea generator, essentially, not the final product. And that can be definitely helpful for any kind of designer. So anyway, it's a very multifaceted, kind of complicated chicken and egg kind of situation. But yeah, I agree. So it's kind of at least should be outlined, taken into account, and at least we should be like thinking about that.
So yeah, Seán touched on the point that generative models are obviously trained on existing data, and actually there's a slightly twisted point that can be made about self-fulfilling prophecies here, because the predictions that we make, the fiction that we write, the way we think about the future of AI ends up in the training set of future generative models. And to the extent that these models can be considered to have beliefs and personalities and what have you, those are actually being shaped by the data that we put out there on the internet. And so yeah, to the extent that the future of AI is going to be determined somewhat by these models and the way that they interact with us, what they say to us, we have to be careful about feedback loops and self-fulfilling prophecies here. And yeah, some people take this to extremes. So on some corners of the internet, people are putting the big bench canary string into their comments when they say, oh, AI might do X, Y, and Z, bad thing. So yeah, it's just a slightly warped perspective on this question you can take.
Thanks, this has been really interesting, but let's open back up to some more questions. Any hands going? I see one there. There's a mic. There should be a microphone coming.
Okay. What do you think should be could be the impact of one? If you publish one language model, and it probably has some kind of opinion, and what could be the impact on democracy or something, like forming decisions for a broad kind of people, and like cultural, yeah, so a lot of people have the same opinion based on the language model.
So I think this is an interesting question, and I think actually I have the opposite concern in some senses, because again, if we look historically, go back 50 years and there were a limited number of newspapers, and those had a small number of kind of opinions and political positions that ran through them, and that was the information diet that was available to the educated person or the lay person in a country. And in some ways, the world in which we're in at the moment, when we have a much, much wider set of information sources, allows us to get access to a lot more views. Now, in practice, the literature says we don't. We form echo bubbles, and we actually collect more sources that agree with us, and we end up, getting even more polarized from each other. And there's a lot of really interesting work happening on that. But I'm not sure a language model necessarily would tip the scales towards like one kind of dominating view on this compared to everything else that's happening. Something I'd be more concerned about is, I had a whole load of fun when ChatGPT was just released. Start playing around with, give me an argument in favor of, let's say, open borders from a libertarian perspective, from a social justice perspective, from a conservative perspective. And it was, the same thing argument I want to push, but it was like emphasizing different angles so they would speak to different values, which was a lot of fun. But that got me, the reason I was thinking about this is, well, let's say I'm somebody who wants to kind of spread propaganda, and I want to like create kind of propaganda at scale. And one of the reasons propaganda doesn't really, like, it's hard to do at scale is because we all have different values. And so like one message lands well with some people, but not so much with other people. But what if I wanted to influence a whole country on a particular issue, and I could just generate like 20 different variants on my message that speak to different sectors of the population's kind of fears and hopes and their kind of political positions and the scandals they were shaped by, and maybe I combine that with a bit of like the sort of Cambridge Analytica thing of like figure out what your personality is like based on your Facebook posts or something, and so then suddenly everybody's getting a different kind of tailored message to them on a particular issue. It seems to me that the possibility for kind of influence campaigns and influence operations with these kinds of tools that allow both kind of figuring out people's positions and also then like creating a differentiated message for those people, that could be huge and that could be quite transformative. I mean, you could imagine like bots showing up on Twitter and being targeted to you based on your like previous record of things you tweeted about, and it all sounds really compelling to you because it speaks to your position. I don't think we're nearly ready for that kind of thing.
So you don't think? Sorry. So you don't think the language model can have a certain opinion that isn't? Yeah. So you just think the language model provides like a mirror of the tasks of the prompts that people are feeding it, or is it like can a language model also have a certain kind of political view for itself?
Well, I mean, a language model is basically, like, I find myself thinking, sorry, I realize Irina's coming in, but very briefly, I keep thinking of the image that's going around the internet at the moment of the Shoggoth, or whatever you call them, the tentacle monster with the human face on the front of it. The tentacle monster is like this giant engine that's sucking up everything on the internet, and like it will produce outputs that reflect that giant vacuum cleaner of stuff on the internet. And then you've got your companies like OpenAI and Anthropic and so on who are like doing some data cleaning and using reinforcement learning on human feedback and so on, and putting a human face on it, where they filter out the like racist stuff that is definitely on the internet, but what we definitely don't want in our language models, and filtering out some of the more extremist stuff that definitely exists on the internet, but that we don't want in our models. And so, like, there's already some engineering happening to like remove some of those opinions, and the end result is something that I know there's some debate at the moment because, like in the past, people have been quite unhappy about like Microsoft Tay spewing out racism, and now people are unhappy because like there are claims that, ChatGPT is happier with like, Democratic positions than it is with Republican positions or so on. So like, there are definitely political opinions, some of which reflect that giant vacuum cleaner on the internet, and some of which reflect how engineering and feedback has been done on the system before it was released. So I definitely think that the model can reflect whatever like combination of those things have gone into giving you the output. I mean, that's definitely the case. But I also think that these things are incredibly powerful tools for creating exactly the set of messages that you want.
Exactly. I mean, essentially, you mentioned what I was about to mention, that precise picture. That's the first thing I thought about. It's not like, you don't think about large language model as a single personality. It's like a multiple personality disorder type of an entity. Well, not disorder maybe, but essentially, yeah, if you don't even filter or instruct or don't put human face, then it's so variable, you pretty much, depending on the prompt, can elicit whatever you want. So that's definitely not the case of like single opinion or single something. So what's going on right now with kind of instruct GPT and so on and putting human face on, it kind of conditions on to only produce certain type of output, and the other output that is sitting in subconsciousness is blocked for now. And again, here's a good question. I mean, on one hand, you kind of limiting systems expression because, for example, new Bing, if you try asking anything interesting, like tell me something about Sydney, immediate answer, I'm not going to talk about that. It's like you ask anything interesting, I'm not talking about that. So, okay, end of conversation. So it's just not going to talk to me. Yeah. Right. So I know, I mean, it's kind of, but bottom line is like, I don't know what to do and what's the best way, but it's definitely being shaped in different ways. And it's highly kind of malleable or flexible thingy that can be shaped in pretty much any kind of interaction. That's why that example that, yeah, if you want kind of personalized messages for people still kind of trying to push certain idea, yeah, you can do that. Anyway, that's a, but bottom line is that I also don't think that there is such thing as a single prevalent opinion that language system has, quote unquote.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, probably. Yeah, hand there.
So, okay, thank you. So, I guess the question I would like to get out of this conference is the following, and perhaps you could answer. I don't know. So, what evaluation techniques scale sufficiently well to check whether general and capable AIs are safe, controllable, or pursue robust representations of objectives that we care about? Yeah, so that's it. Thank you.
That's an interesting question. Does anyone want to jump in on that?
Ethan, probably.
The answer is currently nothing. Like that's like scalable oversight is like one of the open problems.
Right, and evaluation apart. I mean, in terms of evaluation, there is nothing then, or.
I mean, if you, I mean, there's stuff that's like useful, but it's if you're like doing it as like, is it like anything that solves it? Currently, nothing.
Okay. So that was a quick question.
Yeah, I think there's going to be more on this in the afternoon session actually, because that's where it's really going to go into how do we make AI predictable. And I don't know if evaluation is on the agenda for that, but it's a really important topic. There are a couple of initiatives like Archivals kicking off, and I think it's actually going to be one of the most important issues in years to come.
Okay, that was a quick question. Should we go for lunch? Okay, thank you, Irina, especially for staying up so late or early or whatever it is in Canada now.
Oh, it's time for breakfast.
Okay, and can we have a round of applause for all of our panelists?